In this talk, we are going to cover why Uganda needs you and not your prayers. Many of you have been praying since 1900. Majority of you have been praying since 1962, while the vast majority of you have been praying since the mid-1800s, when the Arabs and the Europeans bestowed religion on our communities as a proxy for theft, plunder, rape, and the wholesale exploitation of the Ugandan economy. Now, it's safe to say that those prayers that you have been offering have not worked. Uganda is still considered a poor country, such though when people get ill in Uganda and they have a bit of money, they fly out to a developing country to get treatment. Now, that is not a good sign. We want to get to a place where people fly into Uganda to get treatment. Now, it's not impossible, because if you look at economies like China and Dubai, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, there was nothing there. Now, Uganda is plagued by two problems, and those problems are not Muhoozi and Museveni, and the solution is certainly not Bobby Wine. In fact, I want you to not even think about politics throughout this whole exercise. I want to sway you away from prayers to action. And what action am I talking about? I'm not talking about military action where you go and pick up an AK-47 and start shooting people. I'm talking about economic action, where you, me and you can come together, deploy some economic action to make Uganda a better place. So now, in order for us to proceed, I am going to have to give you a lesson in economics. Call it Mr. MK Digits Economics Lesson 101. So now, let's start with problem number one. What is the problem plagued by Uganda? The first problem that Uganda is plagued with, it has debt. Right? So we must be able to articulate the problem statement before we can talk about remedies. Now, how much debt does Uganda have? Today, as of 2025, Uganda owes about $30 billion, right? Now, what is Uganda? Where is Uganda? Uganda is a landlocked East African country situated in the heart of East Africa. It has a GDP of about $52 billion. What is GDP? GDP is a statistical construct that represents the sum of all transactions in all markets in a given economy. In Uganda, there is a market for wheat. There is a market for tourism. There is a market for food and beverages. There is a market for transportation. So if you have been in Uganda in the past 2024, these figures I'm giving you are 2024, and you have spent money in any of those markets, or you took a flight to Uganda and you spent some money there, you have contributed to that statistical contract of $52 billion. Right. Now, how does that compare to the rest of the world? Well, in the UK, the GDP of the United Kingdom is about $3.2 trillion. United States of America is about $27 trillion. The largest economy in Africa is Nigeria, and they make about $200 billion. Now, how does that compare to companies in the West? In the West, in the UK, the biggest company in the UK is Shell, and it makes about $289 billion. I think it's followed by BP, about $202 billion. Our darling Google makes about $348 billion, and the Instagram, Meta, they make about $139 billion. Now you can look these figures up, and to put things into context, IKEA makes about $40 billion or $50 billion. Cisco makes about $50-60 billion. And so you can see the problem here, that the money generated in Uganda is equivalent to companies here in the West. Now, let's focus on the debt. Uganda owes about $30 billion. Now, that debt can be broken into two sections: internal debt, external debt. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, we are going to focus on external debt, because internal debt, let's define external debt. External debt is debt which is owned by organizations and countries or institutions which are outside of Uganda. Whereas internal debt, Uganda's internal debt is owned by internal institutions. Now, it's assumed that the internal institutions will have the same goals, interests, heart's desires as the country itself because they actually live in that country. Whereas external debt is odious because people like the IMF has been giving money to Uganda for years and USAID, etc. But there are no hospitals in Uganda, i.e. when people get sick, they have to fly out or you'll go to a hospital. I was in Uganda last year and one of my cousins was giving birth and we said we want epidural and they went to see that there is no epidural in the hospital and the next delivery is 2-3 weeks away. Meanwhile, IMF are happy to keep giving Uganda money and keep taking debt payments, but they don't really care that there's no epidural or there's no freaking antibiotics in the hospitals or there's no access to blood or there's not even access to electricity to power up the generators when electricity goes out whilst people are having operations. That really doesn't concern them. What really concerns them is that their bondholders or their creditors get paid on time. And we're going to go into that. So we're going to focus on external debt. The external debt stands at $14.6 billion, whilst the internal debt stands at $14.5 billion. So about a 50-50 split. The internal debt is 37.8% of that $14 billion is owned by commercial banks. And then 67% of that internal debt, of that $14 billion, is owned by T-bonds. People like you and me who are in Uganda who are buying T-bonds. But for now, we didn't come to talk about internal debt because internal debt is considered good for the purpose of this conversation. Let's focus on external debt. The external debt, we're going to split it into two. We're going to split it into multilateral creditors and then bilateral creditors. Now, what's the difference between multilateral and bilateral? A bilateral creditor is an individual country or institution that represents the interests of an individual country that lends money to another country. For example, Exim Bank of China, JIC, Japan International Corporation Bank. Those are bilateral, i.e. bilateral means one country, one interest. Multilateral lenders are institutions or financial houses that represent a group of countries and who have a common set of goals, hearts, desires, and purposes that lend to a country. An example of a multilateral lender or a multilateral creditor is the IMF. Another example is the Africa Development Bank, BADIA, the Arab Development BADEA, you can look it up, IFAD, IMF, World Bank, all those are multilateral lenders. Now, 64% of Uganda's debt is held by multilateral lenders, aka IMF, aka World Bank, aka IFAD, aka IDA, aka USA, aka Washington Consensus. What on earth is the Washington Consensus? The Washington Consensus is a set of policies, prescriptions, which are bestowed on indebted nations that take money from US-based institutions. They focus on three main things: privatization, liberalization, stabilization. Privatization means you've got to sell your goods, sell your telecoms, sell your water, sell your electricity grid. Liberalization, allow USAID to come in and compete with your economies, put them all out of business. There's no longer Uganda Coffee Board. All of these things, they were put out of business by these US corporations. And for example, now, no more used fridges. You have to buy new so that the US and their friends can sell things. But we're going to save that conversation for another day. Then 20% of that 14.6 billion, where an external debt, is held by bilateral creditors. Now, the big one being Exim Bank. So basically, that's China. So now 64% is owned by US, 20% is owned by China. Now, of that 14.6 billion, 12.5% is held by a private creditor. A private creditor is an individual bank or an individual institution that lends money to a country. 12.5% of Uganda's external debt is held by Standard Bank, South Africa, aka Standard Charter, aka UK, right? So there were three main players involved in Uganda's debt. Now, why is this $30 billion worth of debt a goddamn problem? Well, let me explain. The Uganda Revenue Authority generates 29.7 trillion shillings in revenue. That's about $8 billion. Now, the debt servicing and the debt repayments of Uganda are 41.7 trillion shillings. That's about $11 billion, which means the Uganda government has to find at least $11.4 billion, yet it generates $8 billion. So that means the government is forced to run a deficit of 39.7 trillion Uganda shillings, which is equivalent to $10 billion. Now, you can look up these figures, but the total sum of the Uganda national budget is 72.1 trillion Uganda shillings, which equates to about $19.4 billion. Yet, the Uganda Revenue Authority only collects, are you lost? 29.7 trillion Uganda shillings, which is equivalent to about $8 billion, right? You should be able to see the problem. If you don't, let me help you out. The problem is that Uganda's debt is simply unsustainable. What's unsustainable debt? Unsustainable debt is where the interest and debt repayments exceed the income coming into the country. So Uganda's problem stems from not having enough foreign currency coming in, so that because our debts are denominated in dollars, right? In fact, let me tell you what Uganda's debt is denominated in. Of that $14.6 trillion, 44.6% is denominated in SDR. An SDR, special drawing right, is a statistical construct made up by the IMF. It allows the country to gain access to foreign currency denominated in US dollars, euro, or the renminbi, Chinese renminbi. Now, 44.6% of Uganda's debt is held with the IMF and its institutions. 29.5% of that $14 billion is US dollars, right? 19.1% is euros, 2.6% is Chinese renminbi. So, contrary to what popular belief, by far the biggest owner of Uganda's debt is the goddamn US government. That's Uncle Sam and his cronies. And after 20 years of taking their money, Uganda is even in a worse place than it is right now. So now, regardless of who comes into power, regardless of it's Bobby Wine, regardless of it's BSCJ, regardless of whoever it is, they will inherit this problem and they will be stuck with it. So now, if you have to pay 41.7 trillion shillings, i.e. 57% of your budget doing servicing debt repayments and refinancing costs, how much left do you have for health? How much do you have left for education? How much left do you have for development? How much left do you have for even food, right? And I'm going to put that question out to you and you can tell me more about that. Moving on swiftly. Now, before you guys start telling me, well, you know, they racked up these debts, came and they spent it stupidly. No! Be smarter, you bloody so-and-so, right? The history of Uganda's debts is extremely dark. In fact, most of you don't follow me, but I put out a 10-part series on why is Uganda poor, and the first part is the dark history of Uganda's debts. What happened was somebody called a company called the British East India Company came to Africa one day, and they saw how green it was, how organized we were, how democratic we were, and how much of an organized society. This is documented by Speak in the British Library. You can go and read his journal of what he saw when he arrived in Uganda. He didn't see a bunch of savages jumping in, living in monkeys, killing each other. We were quite organized and we were quite civilized. What they decided to do was, they said, oh, do you know what? We want to take all of your resources and we want to take all of your people, we want to take it all. And when they said no, they brought their guns and they shot people. And then they said, okay, you bring your wife, bring your children, I'm going to rape them and I'm going to take everything from here. Now, instead of shooting the men, what they did is they tied him up, they made him look, and they said, choose, which one should I rape? The daughter or your wife? Pick one, you have to pick one. It's going to happen today. And what did they do? They raped everybody and they imposed the British Protectorate. Uganda was a British Protectorate, which means I'm protecting your resources for myself from Germany. What happened was in 1889, Conference of Berlin, or the scramble for Africa, and they carved up Africa. You can go and check all this stuff out. Anyway, I'm not going to go into depth in it. I'm going to say to you, I encourage you to read The Desecration of My Kingdom. This is the only freedom fighter president that we've ever had, and that was Mutesa I, whereby at the turn of independence, he refused to sign the terms of independence because there was something called the Buganda Agreement. The Buganda Agreement is the most horrific agreement that Uganda has ever seen. It's one of the most horrific agreements in the world. But what they did was they exiled the king, they put his son on the throne, then they put a bunch of fat cats around him, who they held at gunpoint, and they said, you got to make sure this boy signs this. And in that Buganda Agreement, Uganda hands over everything to the UK. It didn't hand over, it was wholesale theft. Please read the Uganda Agreement if you haven't read it right now. Anyway, moving on swiftly, how do we know that Uganda was done over in a very bad way? Now, there was an incident in 2009, the European debt debacle, where Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain were effectively bankrupt. Now, at that negotiation, Mariano Rajoy, the then Prime Minister of Spain, told his Finance Minister, Luis de Guindos, that hold out in these negotiations, the Troika, the European Union, the European Central Bank, and IMF were called in to come and solve this issue. And Spain was on its knees. It had run out of money and its banks were bankrupt. And he told his finance minister, hold out, we are the fourth biggest power in Europe. Spain is not Uganda. If they come for us, they're going to have to prepare another $500 billion for Spain, and then Italy, $700 billion, because they're also bankrupt. And in that 2009 period, they said Spain is not Uganda. What he was saying is that, do you know what? We are not Uganda. We will not be bullied. Now, a lot of people said, no, Spain. In fact, if you are one of those people who said, yes, Spain is not Uganda, we are much better, you are not very bright. Because somebody bright should be saying, what was Spain referring to? Why is Spain saying they are not Uganda? I.e., what do they do to Uganda that they're trying to do to us that we don't want to avoid? Because that will allow us to understand what they do to us when we get to positions of negotiating on the financial international market. Now, I asked the question, what was Spain trying to avoid? Well, first of all, it was trying to avoid taking money from the IMF. Why is taking from the IMF very, very, very bad? Now, when you go to take money from the international markets, so for example, today, when Spain wants to borrow money, it will borrow it at a rate of about 0.5%, 0.6%, maybe 1% if it's very high. At the time in 2009, it was about 7%. Uganda borrows money about between 7 and 14%, right? Just to give that into context. Now, when you take IMF money has to be paid ahead of bondholders or people who have lent money, ahead of spending on health, ahead of spending on education, ahead of spending on the general welfare of the population in your country. Where we get to a situation whereby we are paying 57% of our national budget to these foreign institutions, and yet people don't have food and people don't have medicine and there is no antibiotics in the goddamn hospital, and they are happy with this. So, what was Spain trying to avoid, right? Spain was trying to avoid the things that they do to Uganda, i.e., for example, having supervisors. So in Uganda, we have institutions that are supervising us. We have money from the IMF. We have austerity, meaning no money, no free education, no free hospitals, no free medicine. We also have tax reform, mobile money tax, mobile phone tax, this tax, tax on fridges, tax on mobile phones coming in. We also have trade liberalization, right? Trade liberalization where foreign companies come in, they undercut the local economies. Coffee marketing board gone, the rice marketing board gone, all of these agricultural institutions gone. Privatization, they sold everything. Water has been sold, that's why it's so expensive. Electricity has been sold, that's why it's so expensive. I will stop there. Now, to sum it all up, Spain got money from the European Stability Fund, which means that the money that was lost by the bankers was paid by the taxpayers. Now, is that a good thing? Moving on swiftly. Now that we understand the problem, i.e. the debt, is about a very big problem. The problem number 2, which we have, now you're going to see it all lines in, is that we don't have access to dollar-paying customers for our goods and produce, right? For example, when there was copper being made in Uganda, it was sold on the international market between $1 and $2,500 per metric ton. That same copper that left Uganda's ground, arrived in Europe, and it was sold between 9,500 and 12,500 US dollars on the London Metal Exchange. So Uganda was simply not getting that pricing because there is no Ugandan company representing our interests on the London Metal Exchange. Let's get to the solution, right? Let me get to the solution. So now, we've understood that the problem is debt. Debt denoted in a foreign currency. That means we have to earn money in a foreign currency. Now, how can we earn money in a foreign currency? It's so simple, it's stupid. Each one of you.
Action louder than words. Action louder than words. Simusango. By your name, Vimba. By your name, Vimba.